Hello and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week we're exploring something that sits at the heart of connection, the power of storytelling. Now we all tell stories whether we realise it or not. The question is, are we telling the right ones? The stories we tell ourselves shape our confidence, our choices and how others see us. So how do we take control of our own narrative? How do we use language in a way that inspires, energises and brings people with us? And how do we become more intentional in the way we frame our experiences, not just for others, but for ourselves too? So grab a cuppa, get comfy, and join us for Being the Story. Have you got your storytelling head on then, Madamus?
I don't know, I've been looking at the idea of stories and storytelling, and I guess we are both storytellers. I know that you've talked about this before on some of the episodes, that you love stories, you use stories, and I guess in a way I probably do too, but I don't know whether we do it in a different way. I'm going to be interested to hear that. But I actually just sort of started off, before I looked at it in terms of leadership, just in terms of storytelling per se, and this idea, because we've talked about this before, haven't we, about, the crone, the old woman, and there's kind of something ingrained in us, which is why, and I'm sure we'll get onto that, why stories are so important. But I found this really cool little, I think it's probably a blog actually, with the title The Crone as the Storyteller. And actually I can't find who the author is. It's called The Wise Crone's Cottage in the Woods. And they've been reading a book called Once Upon a Time, which is Marina Warner, and she had looked at where all of our fairy tales come from. And, the reality is that all of our early folk tales and our fairy tales, whether they were the sort of sparkly Disney-fied ones, which obviously they weren't, but often were sort of quite grotesque and sort of frightening tales, were actually mainly women. It was the old women, it was the old wives' tale, but it was old women and nurses who told these sort of tales. And so I just kind of like that idea that there's us two old crones.
Stories.
Talking about telling stories and why they're so important, and why they are so ingrained in our psyche, because there's also so many tales about telling tales. Do you get what I mean? So I'm trying to remember, there's a famous book written, the Decameron. I'm just saying that really badly, but that was turned into a Netflix movie recently, and that was about people in the plague who end up stuck together, and they tell stories to keep themselves busy. And then there's another one called the Pentatone, something like that.
This is a great story.
Terrible Italian accent. and that's all about 5 women who have to tell 50 stories over 10 days. And so in order to save something. And of course then there's the Scheherazade story from the Arabian Nights, where she had to tell a story every night to save her life, and maybe I wouldn't be able to save my life by telling that story. But I'm just fascinated by the idea of a story about storytelling. I just think that's kind of very meta.
It's not something that I've dug into or researched before we've started this, but what it springs to mind is that, if you go back to the pictures on walls in caves from all those years ago, they were telling stories of hunting and survival and everything else besides. And the reason that we now know about that from history is because of the way that they managed to learn to convey story. And then we also know, before paper and pen or tablets and, going forward in technology, that people told stories about life, their environment and everything else besides, so that those got captured. We can get into religion as well, can't we, in terms of all of the storytelling there. But there has never been a moment in my life, nor do I ever want there to stop being, as part of my life, that is storytelling. So you can talk meta, and then if we talk about our own experiences, I mean, my favourite programme on telly as a child was Jack and Ori.
Oh gosh, I'd forgotten all about that.
Bagpuss.
And what about Bagpuss?
Always telling a story. And story time, when you all used to sit, I see it now with going into schools and how much books play a part. I mean, rather, my schools, and I love this, the ones where I'm a governor, they have a vending machine but not for sweets and chocolate. It's for books. And as the Governor's Awards, we get to give them their awards if it's for, what's gone on in class or for different things that they've done during the half term. They get given a golden token by me in their school assembly, and then they get to run to the vending machine and choose the book that they want.
Oh wow,
just
that's
sort
so
of
cool.
Stretch a little bit because, but showing the importance of storytelling. But in the corner all together having a story, bedtime stories with kids. I do that. My grandson has 3 stories a night. But I can also remember my brother's favourite book when he was a child. He's 6 years younger than me. He's about to turn 50, and we still talk about Harry Carrot Seed now and still quote things from the book. So I am a firm believer in things are absolutely steeped in stories from a very young age. And yet and I think it'd be good to talk about, I've got sort of like 10 reasons why stories are effective, because I think that when we think about all of those things from a childhood perspective, and I know we're going to talk about in a later episode about play, but storytelling and the language and the connection that you can get from that, when I think about those sort of like elements, I do think it plays a part in leadership and getting messages across that sometimes facts and figures just don't do.
I'm thinking whether or not, now I had a little bet with myself as to whether or not we were going to end up referring to some similar thing. And so I had put a bet on that there is a video by Saint Simon Sinek about the importance of storytelling in leadership. So I'm putting a bet on that you had actually flagged that as one of the things that you were going to talk about.
Because I had a bet with myself that because you probably almost want to have his children if you weren't married already, that you would. So I went looking elsewhere to leave. I'm not used to sharing.
Fair enough.
I'm not used to sharing my men, Bridge. So you can have him.
Okay, so there is a video which I will share about the importance of stories by Saint Simon Sinek. And it's actually a very short little video where he starts talking about importance of modeling behavior, but then talks about the power of stories and why they're so important. And I think we'll get into some of that because, as you said, you've got the 10 reasons why they are so powerful. And there's a couple of other articles that I've sort of come across that talk about this idea of people use stories to be persuasive. But actually, we kind of need to understand why they're persuasive, right? What is it about that? What's this visceral thing? And Saint Simon, in his little bit about storytelling, he goes, I'm going to quote Stalin, because I think it was Stalin who said, 1 million people dying in a famine is a statistic, but you tell the story of one person who died in the famine, and then that's a tragedy. It's something that when I've worked in the humanitarian context, we're very aware of, that, you can turn around and talk about the devastation of a famine or the devastation of a flood, and the numbers are too big for people to get, everyone just goes, oh my God, that's just awful, but it's just such a big thing, I can't do anything about it. But if you show a story about an individual, a woman or a child or a father who've lost someone or who are starving, and they've got a name, and then we relate to that, and then people are much more likely to want to become involved in helping because they've got a story, rather than just a set of numbers that are just like,
I read
numbers,
in my,
awful.
Research that I did, which didn't include your man. So this was from an organisational psychologist called Peg Neuhauser. But she found that learning, which stems from a well-told story, is remembered more accurately and for longer than learning derived from facts and figures. So that's just corroborating that element that you said there. And then similarly, there's another psychologist, Jerome Bruner, whose research suggests that facts are 20 times more likely to be remembered if they're part of a story. And we talked about the fact that we might be talking about stories and the power of language as well. And I'm struck by what you're saying there, that telling a story rather than referring to it as a case study. And so I said at the beginning about storytelling being part of creating connection, and it is persuasion or influence where you are looking to target your audience so that you are looking to change their attitude, their belief, increase their knowledge, change their behaviour, whatever it might be. And that comes from storytelling rather than necessarily facts and figures. the other thing I was going to say about those connections I'm readily making to stories that have been around my family for 49 years, you know, with my brother just about to turn 50. Sorry about that, Jono. Just giving you age away. Maybe we'll have to delete that, or maybe not. But you don't find people going, oh my God, I must take you through just all the things that I took from the latest PowerPoint presentation that I listened to. It doesn't happen. Whereas if those slides have been part and parcel of a strong narrative, using the power of language, using the power of storytelling, I think that builds connection in exactly the same way that I'm building connection with my grandson. I built connection with my teachers. I built connection with my family, you know, in those early years of storytelling, and how that can actually go all the way through and into our adulthood, and indeed where stories have come from.
Yeah, totally. I think it is because it's so innate in us, and whether that, comes from the crone, or whether it comes from our experiences as children, or whether it actually is sort of this thing that's part of our psyche from the times where our ancestors sat round the fire and passed wisdom on through a story, or through singing, or the bard who would wander around the country singing stories about what was going on elsewhere in the world. And that was kind of the equivalent of, well, yeah, the internet, I guess, sort of. But, there is this sort of real, just visceral thing about us, and maybe we're going to pick that apart a little bit. What's the difference between just putting some facts and jumbling them around into a word salad, or constructing a story, and what it is about a story that is so impactful, persuasive, kind of gets into our brain in a way that just some random facts in a line just
Before we
doesn't.
go on to that, I think there's something interesting as well. That we appear, because we've done our usual thing of let's not tell each other what we're doing in terms of our research. I love that. I think that's part of our USP, to be honest. And just then going, surprise, when we get onto the recording. But how we've come at it, because I've started at the beginning of my life. I'm not saying that you started at the end of your life, but you started.
Please don't say that.
No. Please,
yeah,
not what I meant.
Not right
but
now.
Do you know what I mean? That you're taking it and looking at stories through the lens of the wisdom and the giving back sort of like element, whereas I have gone from the childlike approach of it, where I've been on receive. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes.
We're only doing one element to it. But because we're back to the connection piece, I'm probably, this is a really half-baked thought, but it is the reception of what the memory can feel like when you get a good story, as well as the connection that you can have when you're telling a good story. It's pretty half-baked, but it is that whole element about you need both pieces of it, because you're talking about the structure that you're giving to stories, and I'm saying from my childlike end of the spectrum that what was the structure that was going on, or the environment, or whatever it might have been, for me to still have those very inherent memories of the stories that I was being told or that I heard. And then you're coming at it from the end of, the wisdom giving. And so what environments and what structures do you actually want to be able to be in the giving mode of the good story to the people who are receiving it? So I think I was in violent agreement with you, but was just interested to see that we had come at it from different ends of the spectrum. Mine being very much about receipt, and yours being very much about how are you giving the wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily suggest by any means that anything that comes out of my mouth is wisdom, but
every now and again.
But the persuasion element, yes, maybe once in a while everyone just goes, just a bit like once in a while someone says
You're
that I'm patient, and I'm like,
Harry,
I'm sorry, what? I'm not. No, I'm gonna actually, I might write it down somewhere and put it in my diary, because it's a one-off. Mohammed will be there listening, going, what? I'm sorry, who is this? This is not my wife. And I guess maybe it's because I've come from, being an advocate as a lawyer, and then doing advocacy now in a humanitarian context, is that a lot of the time we're trying to persuade, trying to influence. And often there are incredible stories. But, I am with you in terms of when I was a kid. We come from that very same background in terms of being brought up with bedtime stories and being totally enamored with books and disappearing off in my own little magical world of bunnies and fairies and goblins. And I'd be dancing around the garden in a piece of wispy veil and all kinds of stuff like that. So yeah, I just wonder where we go from receiving those stories as children to then incorporating, or what it is about stories that then remain so powerful throughout our life, rather than, I get, you can kind of understand why it will be wonderful for children to listen to these things, but why as adults are we still so wrapped up and influenced, and why are our brains focused on stories? Why is it that stories can have this sort of really powerful
Yeah,
impact?
so
It's just kind of,
so
I'm just
I
wondering that.
well, a bit of a personal story first, because I'm hoping that this might help us allude to something. But when I left the army and sort of like went into the corporate world, and this is probably a story I might tell twice on a different episode as well, but it does make sense because it was very much about Excel spreadsheets, facts and figures, reports, just the whole lifeblood sucked out of anything that I was really used to. And it wasn't until I got into my self-development and doing my coaching that, and I probably told this story before as well, but quite how much I realised that I had taken creativity out of my life. And finding ways back into that got me back into the art of storytelling, and realising that in the way that I was writing reports, they also needed to tell a story, even if they needed to be sort of like quite formal or whatever it might be. It was, what's the strand, what's the story, how am I getting through that, which will bring us a little bit onto talking about structure. But what I realised in all of that, and this has been corroborated by some of the stuff that I looked at before this episode, was this business about neuroplasticity. I can't say that word without my teeth nearly flying out. And those elements of that, there's so much of our brains that is wired around storytelling of a fashion. So the prefrontal cortex being involved in decision making and problem solving, which are both crucial for creative processes, of course. And then your temporal lobes associated with processing language and narrative comprehension. And the fact that we, as adults, if we've let it go, can reteach ourselves creativity and rewiring, parts of our brain to extend our neuroplasticity so that we can be more in this art of storytelling. And I've also talked, of course, a lot about practice. I practice stories all the time. So my nieces had a whole story written for them around this imaginary creature that I had created for their advent calendar this year. And of course then, because I've got plenty of time on my hands, I then went and created images of all of them on AI and made them a notebook with all of these new characters on the front of a notebook for a Christmas present.
Well, you heard it here first. The Bobby Davis
Yes.
Children's Story Collection coming up soon.
Because of course then that completely screws me, because they think that Father Christmas bought it and then things will be destroyed. So Sarah, Jono, please don't let them listen. I really hope they're not listening to this podcast, actually, because this is definitely not for children.
Well, yes, one of our guests, Lucy, pointed out that she actually reads the podcast because the language in it is not appropriate for children.
So I definitely, so that's some level of practice, but to take it more into the adult realm, I would often be in businesses saying, look, what's the story? What is the story that we are trying to tell here? And it's not, and then they all lived happily ever after. But the structures of stories, when I think about reporting, and indeed with what I'm doing with coaching, has a similar structure. And there's a similar line to it, which is a case of, well, here we are now. This is what's going on. These are the people that are playing a part in it. Often this is what we think about ourselves or whatever it might be, but there is a starting point. And I often say in storytelling, what's the as is? Now, when we actually want to add in facts to all of that, we can add in facts in there as well, but it is the story, it's the starting point. Once upon a time, there was an organisation and its stats look like this. I'm being quite basic, but there we have it. And then you may well talk about, well, what is the possibility that we want to head towards? What do we want it to look like? And it may well be just the end of a chapter. It's not necessarily the end game. And within organisations, never do you have and we all live happily ever after, because it's always got to be progressive. But there is this new imaginary world or possibility or thing that you're heading towards. And then you can talk about the bits that happen in between, or what you want to have happen in between. And equally, you know, there can then be some level of risk or nightmare that happens, and so you go off on a bit of a divergence and it looks like that. So there are ways of actually structuring your report which I think is very much like a story, but you almost have to think in story language and then start fitting the components in the right. And I said we would talk about tone and language and stuff as well, because it has to fit with the environment or the audience that you are trying to compel or enroll.
Yeah, I think there's another element of why stories are powerful, and a lot of what you've said fits into that. Is that so? One of the things I was looking at was this idea of, we have these cognitive biases as human beings, and one of them is called a narrative bias, because we look for meaning, we look for patterns, and so our brain needs a narrative or a story to explain things that might not originally appear connected. So that's why they're so persuasive. Or if, as a leader, if you're doing change management, that actually creating the pattern in terms of the narrative to explain things just allows us to understand it better. And it's a bit like, I guess, when we talked in the sleep episode about dreaming and how important sleep is, because the dreaming phase allows our brain to process things and put them into a pattern, create the story around the pattern. And that's why sometimes you'll wake up after having a dream and that you'll suddenly go, oh God, I understand that now. And the other element that's part of what our biases are is that we kind of like bizarre things. And we like something that's memorable. We like things that are a little bit unusual. It helps us remember. We will remember things much more if there's a bit of spice to the story. And I'm not talking saucy spice now. Saucy spice, that's a bit food. But I'm not talking, sauciness. Although, that also is, it can be a really good way of making people always remember those sort of stories. So, yes, and of course, the reference to the stocking story from Santa's,
Sadly,
everybody still remembers that because there's a little bit of sauce. But, so using language that is relatable and using language that is appropriate to the audience, I guess. So you have to be appropriate, but sometimes throwing in a little bit of a curveball in terms of how you're describing things will jolt people, which will be enough to make them remember it. So I think that that's another element in terms of things to remember when we're
I agree, because the
telling
other thing,
stories.
The other thing I found, so back into the way that we go about this, again from the child end of this story, for want of a better word, is they are experts in divergent thinking, because they don't know, they don't rush to a solution because they don't know what it is. So they keep themselves really open to any given situation, also slightly outlandish some of the time. Whereas I spend a lot of time within companies when I'm doing team development saying we're not here to be solutioneering. I'm saying, what's the story? Stop getting into this bit and trying to know what the end game element is to it. And I've never heard of this before, but the scamper technique.
Oh no, I've not heard of it either. Go for it.
Yes, I was scampering around. It's not quite what I meant. Let's go
scampering around.
Again, another completely different podcast episode. But this is a psychological exercise that's used to generate ideas. It's an acronym. So scamper stands for substitute. So what can you change in a given situation? Combine. Does combining elements help the situation? So, what's the interconnectedness, across departments even, or whatever that might look like. Adapt. What existing element could you repurpose? Modify. What can you change? Put into use. Should you use this project or product or thing that you're trying to achieve in a different way? Eliminate. What do you need to get rid of? And reverse. Do you need to look at the situation from another point of view, which I think helps with these biases as well, so that it's like getting into another person's position. It's a bit like when we talked about De Bono's hats. So I really like that, and I'll put that in the references as well. But yes, scamper as a way of deciding the elements of the story that you need to tell. Again, in an organisational concept rather than just creating advent calendar stories for your nieces. I think what comes across
Yeah, that's really cool, and it really reminds me of a lot of the work I did last year. Gosh, last year in the design principles when I was looking at design and creativity and innovation and leadership. But I didn't come across that mnemonic for the design process, but that plays a lot into the design process. So yeah, really cool. And I like this idea that in a way, designing something is amending a story or changing a story or creating a story. And obviously, yeah, I mean, when you write or a novelist is designing, involved in creativity, etc. So yeah, that's super cool, and I like that. It's a really interesting concept to put to leaders or teams that we're just trying
Yeah.
to develop a story rather than solve a problem, or as you said, that the solving the problem or the solutioning, coming up with the solution is the end of the process. But when people try and find the solution, they're starting at the end of the story, and we have to understand the story first, and
Well,
then
it's a bit
yeah,
like,
then you
and
write the
again, I'm going
ending.
to put this back into the concept of telling my grandson a bedtime story. Now that he knows some of the best books, if you rush through it, try to miss a page out, or Once Upon a Time, tra la la la, and they lived happily ever after, he'll be like, if he knew how to say it, what the hell do you think you're doing, Jumar? You've missed out all of the steps. And I think it's the same very simple concept at work. Yeah, great. So what's the actual process for getting there? What's the transition? What's the transformation? What are all the things that we've got to think about beforehand? And I see it again and again where people have tried to rush the story. And the whole
Yeah,
thing is that I firmly believe in organisations, if you can get everyone to get their mitts around a story, they stay with it in a way that, whilst of course there is a place for Six Sigma and lean and all of the different design processy things, that again, when you're stuck like that, you can get stuck altogether in the story. Whereas if you've changed the line of what it is, that people will go, well, where are we up to? What chapter are we on? But there's a greater freedom in it, I think.
yeah, yeah. And also I think when we were looking at creativity, particularly and design processes, one of the things that everyone to keep emphasizing to people was, okay, so we're going to have a go at this, we're going to have a look at this, and there's no right or wrong answer. And because often the thing that stultifies creativity is a fear
Yeah.
of getting the wrong answer. And I think, same with play and all kinds of things. And we maybe talk about that when we talk about play in the next episode. But as adults, we often get afraid of making a mistake or failing or whatever it is. And so always, the first thing that was introduced to us was like, there is no right answer to this. This is just see what happens. It's an experiment. And that was our mantra, it's an experiment. So there's no right or wrong answer, doesn't matter. Just see what happens. And it took quite a long time for people to get comfortable or more comfortable with that idea that there's no right or, especially for people who are high achievers, to be told there's no answer, no correct answer, or not only one answer is like, no, what do you mean?
Yeah.
But I need an A in this. I need to win. And I think that it's easier when it's put in the context of this is a story. People maybe find it easier to get that into their head. It doesn't matter. This is not a only one solution. There's like 750 possible ways we can look at this. Let's have a
Well,
look and
in
see which
fact,
one we like.
whilst we haven't sort of like gone through, and here's the 10 reasons storytelling is effective, but we've near on covered all of them.
Aren't we
The place
clever?
to is that in the telling of a story, it's actually showing a great deal more mutual respect for everybody who's involved. Because one, if everyone is involved in the story, there's not one person telling people what to think or do. So everything is invited and welcome in the space. Whereas some of those sort of shapes that we talked about, the constructs of how we're going to get there, the project management elements and all the rest of it, look, I don't want people sort of like thinking, oh my God, she's just thrown all that out the window. Because there's a place for all of that, and it can be a bedrock, but you don't always have everybody sat in the room who's done the Prince 2 training or the Six Sigma training or whatever it might be. So people are already at a disadvantage when you've got some sitting there understanding all of the concepts of it and others going, what the fuck is this? Whereas a story tell is a construct that everyone can be involved in and everybody can play a part in.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for an organisation.
So a couple of exercises that kind of breaks it down to stop people feeling that there's one person who's leading the narrative. I'm sure you've done it, where you pass on the story. One person does a little drawing and then they pass it on, and the next person has to do another little drawing that moves the story forward. And then, you keep going and you go backwards and forwards if it's in a pair. And I remember doing this very early on in this course, and it was so frustrating because I decided what was going to happen in my story from my first picture. And the person, who took the next one just went off on this weird, what the fuck is that supposed to be? And I'm just like taking it back to my story. And then it just got to a point where they're going, oh my God,
You're so
this is
controlling.
terrible. You're so fucking controlling. What's wrong with you? And then after a while, you kind of give up and let them go. And then whatever they've drawn, you think, oh God, that's funny. I'm going to go off on a completely different tangent. And then it frees you. Suddenly you get this point where you're free of what you decided your preconceptions were. And you end up, yes, now there's a dragon, and now we've just sailed off to an island, and they've fallen off the end of the world, and they've entered into the mouth of a big cat. Whatever it is, whereas I started off with a lovely little story about a couple who went for a walk in the woods. And then suddenly we're on another planet flying around on dragons and with unicorns. So there is this point where it frees you. And I really remember that aha moment where I just was like, oh, Bridge, you're so fucking controlling and you need to just let go. And it was fun and I was happy. And we look at each other and I think we both had sort of the same point. We both realised that we were no longer frustrated with each other for whatever fucking random nonsense. And we kind of looked and we realised we learnt the lesson at the same time. And we were like, oh.
And of course, when you go back to the acronym of Scamper, you can decide once you've got your story down what you're eliminating and what you can flip. So you could have ended up with your dodgy walk in the woods that you were actually after, but you were probably dressed as a unicorn and whatever it might be. So yes, I mean, all of the bits can actually play, but it's keeping it free and then deciding where it comes down to. I mean, I've seen with this group as well. Have you heard of the Humphrey group?
No.
And they've written a book called Influence Through Stories, The Leadership Power of Narrative. And I love what they've done because it captures all of it. They talk about the 5 essential types of stories that leaders need to learn to tell. So Scamper, or whatever acronym you actually want, or any of the structures we've been talking about, can be applied in these 5 types. And so these are the ones that I reckon that, we could be saying to anybody, well, actually, I'm saying leaders. I wonder if they are life stories as well, because they probably are. So I'm just going to run through them really quickly. So this narrative about the journey through the past. So that's that respect for the history to get you to the as-is point, where we've got to, sort of like sketch. So that's very much about one of the stories I was talking about in the beginning. Then you've got the where we're going story. So that's the transformational, the transition bit. And that can be real or imagined, because that's all of that conceptual thinking and the divergent thinking about where do we want to take this. I like this one. The signature analogy. What is the mean? Talk about the power of language. I can't even speak or write. Say it again.
Analogy.
I wasn't going to call it an analogy because that would have been quite bad as well. Well, I can do, but nobody.
Well, you can do. Again, that would people will remember that now.
Analogy, right? Analogy. Jesus. So. It draws on personal interest and experience to craft stories that resonate with the audience. It's that whole thing about our ability to harness our vulnerability for the best connections we can have. They're probably the trickiest ones for people to be willing to hand over to other people, but they are the ones that build the strongest connections. The what success can look like story, so the motivational speaking element to it. And again, everyone can play a part in that to bring, big ideas together and to life. And then one that I think that when you said at the beginning, you weren't sure whether you were a storyteller or not, but the stories that we tell quite a lot of is the worst case scenario, because we found ourselves in
yes. And then I ended up naked in a tree.
I don't know if we have had that one, but that's for another time.
No, I'm not sharing that one.
Another time, but it is about sharing the stories about failure, disappointment or when you were naked in a tree. But again, no one's ever going to forget that either. But I thought that, I mean, I will put their link on because they've got some great stuff online about the power of narrative and storytelling as well, which is super cool.
Oh, cool. Well, we have kind of got to the end. Did you have the 10 things? Is that something we can share in the...
find the link, because I think I'd sort of like done an encapsulation, but I'll work out how to do them. But needless to say, I think we managed somehow or another without actually listing them to get through them. So I'm quite pleased with that too. You'll just have to take it
stories rather than listing, which is much more interesting.
Absolutely.
And we did all 10, honest.
Anyway, I thought I had 2 quotes. I'm just trying to remember what I've done with the other one now. Oh, there it is, because I really liked it. So can I do 2?
Sure. No, you can't, Bobby, no.
Okay, so here's the first one. It goes with what I was saying about respect for audience. If there was ever a time when you could just order people to do something, it has long since passed. Telling a story where you underline the moral is a great way of explaining to people what needs to be done without saying, do this. I like that.
Because Jesus did that a lot.
Did he?
Parables.
Yes, another parables, of course. A parable to go with our
analogy and the microave.
Anyway, so I like this one. You know, we also said at the beginning about there are stories for life, there's stories for learning, there's stories for leadership, and there's the stories we tell about ourselves. And I love this. So this is the last one. Your story is being written. Make sure you're holding the pen. I like that.
Very profound.
And that's us.
All right, my lovely. Yes. Well,
Indeed.
yeah.
Take care.
See you next week. Bye. Bye.
Thanks for listening. As always, you'll find all the resources we mentioned on your podcast platform of choice, ready for whenever you want to dig a little deeper. Next week, well, it's here! Not a short, not a reflection, but now finally a whole episode on play. Because as I said once before, well actually more like a stuck record, play is not just for kids. It's a power source. Fuel for creativity, resilience, and those moments when we need to shake off the serious and find a new way forward. So what kind of play character are you? Indeed, is play a part of your life or something you think you've grown out of? And what could play bring us all if we just let even a little more into our lives? I, for one, am ridiculously excited for this one, so please feel free to come and skip, dance and hop to join us next time for Being Playful.